Kim Tae-jin didn't build his empire by being merciful. At 42, he controlled the most sophisticated criminal network on the West Coast, a vast operation that stretched from the ports of Los Angeles to the tech corridors of San Francisco. Money laundering, high-end theft, protection, his organization moved through the shadows of legitimate business like smoke through silk. But every emperor has his weakness, and Tae-jin's was the woman sleeping in the bedroom upstairs. He'd met Simone Richardson 5 years ago at a charity gala, of all places. She was there representing the nonprofit she'd founded, advocating for youth education in underserved communities. He was there laundering his reputation, writing checks that made society matrons smile and ask no questions. She wore gold that night, her dark skin luminous under the chandeliers, her natural hair swept up in a way that made her neck look endless. When she spoke about the kids she worked with, her eyes held a fire that made his chest tighten in a way he didn't recognize. He pursued her relentlessly. She resisted for months, sensing something dangerous beneath his polished exterior. But Tae-jin could be patient when it mattered, and eventually, Simone's defenses crumbled. They married 2 years later in a ceremony that blended Korean and African-American traditions, their families eyeing each other with polite suspicion across the aisle. Simone knew her husband was involved in business. She wasn't naive, but she didn't know the extent of it. Tae-jin had built a wall between his two lives, and he intended to keep it standing forever. Grace Okonkwo had worked in the Kim household for 8 months. At 63, she'd been a maid for wealthy families most of her adult life, ever since immigrating from Nigeria 30 years ago. She'd learned long ago that rich people's homes held secrets, and the best way to keep her job was to see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing. But Grace was not deaf, and she was not blind. She'd been dusting the hallway outside Tae-jin's study when she heard the voices, his, and 2 others she recognized as his lieutenants, Park and Chen. The door wasn't quite closed, and their Korean mixed with English drifted through the gap. "The shipment arrives Tuesday," Park said. 40 kilos, the Russians are getting impatient." "Let them wait," Tae-jin replied coldly. "We move on my schedule, not theirs." "And the witness," Chen's voice was quieter, "the one from the warehouse incident." A long pause. Grace's hand froze on her dust cloth. "Handle it quietly, no trace back to us." Grace moved away silently, her heart pounding. She'd suspected, of course, but hearing it confirmed was different. She thought of Mrs. Kim, Simone, who was always kind to her, who asked about her grandchildren and had given her a generous bonus last Christmas. Did she know? Could she possibly know what her husband truly was? 3 weeks later, Tae-jin received news that shattered his carefully constructed world. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe less. The doctor's words echoed in his skull as he sat alone in his car in the hospital parking garage. He was 42 years old, and he was dying. He didn't tell Simone right away. How could he? She'd been talking about starting a family, about the life they'd build together. Instead, he threw himself deeper into work, trying to secure everything, to make sure she'd be protected and provided for when he was gone. But the pain grew worse, and the secrets grew heavier. It was a Thursday evening when everything came crashing down. Grace was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when she heard the shouting from upstairs. She froze, her hands in the sink. "You think I'm stupid," Simone's voice cracked through the house. "I found the files, Tae-jin, the bank accounts, the shipment manifests, everything." Grace crept toward the staircase, her heart hammering. "Simone, please." Tae-jin's voice was weak, strained. He'd been deteriorating rapidly, the cancer eating through him faster than the doctors predicted. "Please what? Please pretend I don't know my husband is a criminal, that people have died because of you." Simone's voice broke with tears. "Who are you? Who did I marry?" Grace reached the top of the stairs. Through the open bedroom door, she could see them. Tae-jin was on his knees, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. He looked 20 years older than he had at breakfast. Simone stood by the window, a folder of documents clutched in her shaking hands. "I'm dying," Tae-jin said, his voice barely above a whisper. Simone froze. "What?" Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, I have weeks, maybe days. He looked up at her, and Grace saw tears streaming down his face. I was trying to protect you, to set everything up so you'd be safe, so you'd be taken care of. By lying to me, by building a life on blood money. Simone's voice was hollow. I know. Tae-jin reached out toward her. I know what I am, I know what I've done, but I love you, Simone, that was never a lie. You were the only real thing in my life. Don't, Simone backed away. Don't make me the excuse for your choices. Tae-jin's body seemed to crumple further. One more round, he whispered. Give me one more round. Let me fix what I can. Let me make arrangements to get out, to dismantle this thing I built. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for time to try to make it right. Make it right, Simone laughed bitterly. How do you make murder right? How do you make trafficking right? I can't, but I can stop it from continuing. I can turn evidence over to the feds, dismantle the network, make sure no one else takes my place. His voice grew urgent. I can testify. I can give them everything. But I need time to do it right, to make sure you're protected from the fallout. Simone stared at him, tears running freely now. You're really dying. Yes. Grace pressed herself against the hallway wall, barely breathing. Mrs. Kim, Grace's voice made them both turn. She stepped into the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her. I'm sorry, I heard. Simone's eyes widened. Grace, how long have you? 8 months, ma'am. I've known for 8 months. Grace looked at Tae-jin, then back at Simone. I should have said something, should have warned you, but I was afraid. Afraid I'd lose my job, afraid of what Mr. Kim might do. She took a breath. I'm not afraid anymore. Tae-jin looked at her, exhausted. What do you want, Grace? Money, a guarantee. No, sir. I want to tell Mrs. Kim what I think she should do. Simone wiped her eyes. Tell me. Grace moved closer. My husband was a bad man, not like Mr. Kim, but bad enough. He drank, he gambled, he hurt me. When he got sick, everyone said I should stay, should forgive him, should let him die in peace. She looked directly at Simone. I left, and I never regretted it, not for one day. The room was silent. But, Grace continued, my husband never tried to make amends, never tried to fix the damage he'd done, never offered to turn his life around, even at the end. She glanced at Tae-jin. If Mr. Kim means what he says, if he'll really testify and dismantle his organization, then maybe there's something worth saving. Not the marriage, maybe, but the chance to stop the cycle, to prevent others from being hurt. That's worth something. Simone sank into a chair. I don't know if I can forgive this. You don't have to, Grace said gently. Forgiveness is for you to decide in your own time, if ever. But you can give him the chance to do the right thing. Not for him. For all the people who'll be safer if his organization falls apart rather than passing to someone worse. Tae-jin looked at Grace with something like wonder. Why are you helping me? I'm not helping you, sir. I'm helping her. Grace nodded toward Simone. And I'm helping myself sleep at night, knowing I finally spoke up when it mattered. The next 3 weeks were a whirlwind. Tae-jin, with Simone's cold permission, met with federal prosecutors. He handed over files, bank account numbers, names, locations. His lieutenants were arrested. His network crumbled as federal agents swept through warehouses and offices and legitimate businesses that had been fronts. Simone moved into the guest room. She didn't speak to Tae-jin except when necessary, but she stayed. Grace wasn't sure if it was compassion or simply the need to see it through to the end, to make sure he actually followed through. Grace herself found her role changing. She became a witness for the prosecution, corroborating dates and meetings she'd observed. The federal agents promised her protection, a new identity if needed. But Grace had stopped running a long time ago. Tae-jin deteriorated rapidly. The stress of the investigation, combined with the cancer, aged him visibly. He spent most days in bed, too weak to do more than sign documents and answer questions from lawyers and agents who gathered around him like vultures waiting for the last bits of useful information. It was a Tuesday morning when Grace found Tae-jin sitting in the garden, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm California sun. He'd insisted on being brought outside, needing to see the sky one more time. Grace, he said quietly as she approached with his medication. Thank you. She didn't pretend not to know what he meant. You're welcome, sir. Take care of her. After I'm gone, she'll need someone. I will. He looked at her with eyes that seemed ancient. Do you think she'll ever forgive me? Grace considered the question carefully. I think, Mr. Kim, that forgiveness isn't something you can earn. It's something that's given freely or not at all. You did the right thing in the end. That counts for something. But whether it counts for forgiveness, that's Mrs. Kim's choice to make. Tae-jin nodded slowly. I love her. That was always true. I know, sir. It wasn't enough, though. Love isn't enough if you don't honor it with your actions. No, sir, it's not. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the birds in the trees. That evening, Simone came down from her room and sat beside Tae-jin's bed. Grace, passing by the open door, heard her speaking softly. I can't forgive you, not yet, maybe not ever. Simone's voice was thick with tears. But I'm grateful you stopped running, that you tried to make it right. Tae-jin's hand reached for hers. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. I'm sorry, he whispered. For all of it, for lying, for who I was, for the time we lost. I'm sorry too, Simone said. Sorry for what could have been. Grace quietly moved away, giving them privacy for whatever last words they needed to share. Epilogue. Kim Tae-jin died 6 days later, with Simone holding his hand. His testimony led to 43 arrests and the dismantling of one of the largest criminal organizations on the West Coast. The FBI called it one of the most significant takedowns in recent history. Simone sold the house and donated much of Tae-jin's legitimate assets to victims' funds and criminal justice reform organizations. She went back to her nonprofit work, throwing herself into the mission of helping kids find better paths than the ones that had destroyed her husband. Grace stayed with her for another year, until Simone insisted she retire and enjoy her grandchildren. They remained close, calling each other every week, two women bound by the truth they'd faced together. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Simone thought about that last night, about Tae-jin's plea for one more round. He'd gotten it. Not redemption, exactly. Not forgiveness, not really. But a chance to stop the machine he'd built, to prevent his empire from falling into worse hands. It wasn't enough to erase the harm he'd caused, but it was something. And in the end, Grace reflected, sometimes something is all we get. The question is what we do with it. She thought of Tae-jin on his knees, begging for one more chance. She thought of Simone, strong enough to give it even through her pain. And she thought of herself, finally finding the courage to speak up when silence would have been easier. 3 people, all trapped in their own ways, all finding the strength to do the right thing when it mattered most. That, Grace decided, was a story worth telling. 3 months after the funeral, Simone sat in a lawyer's office in downtown Los Angeles, staring at documents that made her stomach turn. I don't understand, she said, her voice tight. I thought we'd liquidated everything. Marcus Chen, the estate attorney, adjusted his glasses. He was one of the few lawyers Tae-jin had employed who hadn't been implicated in the criminal enterprise. He'd handled only the legitimate holdings. These accounts were separate. Your husband set them up in your name 2 years ago. They were never part of the criminal network. Clean money, all of it documented and taxed properly. Simone looked at the figure on the paper. $7 million. He wanted you to have a choice, Marcus continued. That's what he told me when he set this up. He said if anything ever happened to him, you should have enough to walk away completely. Start over, be free. Grace, who had accompanied Simone to the meeting, reached over and squeezed her hand. There's something else, Marcus said, pulling out a sealed envelope. He left this for you, made me promise to give it to you only after everything was settled with the federal case. Simone's hands trembled as she took the envelope. Tae-jin's handwriting on the front, for Simone, the truth. They read it together that evening in Simone's new apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in Pasadena, far from the mansion and its ghosts. Grace made tea while Simone sat on the couch, the letter unopened on her lap. Do you want me to leave? Grace asked gently. No, stay, please. Simone took a breath and opened the envelope. The letter was 10 pages long, written in Tae-jin's precise handwriting. Simone began reading aloud, her voice wavering. My dearest Simone asterisk. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and the prosecutors have what they needed. I hope I had the courage to see it through. I hope I didn't fail you one last time. You deserve to know how this started. Not excuses, there are none, but the truth. I was 17 when my father was killed. He owned a small grocery store in Koreatown, and he refused to pay protection money to the gang that ran our neighborhood. They made an example of him, beat him to death in front of his own store while customers watched and did nothing. My mother never recovered. She died 2 years later. The official cause was a heart attack, but I know it was a broken heart. She lost everything, her husband, her business, her sense of safety in the world. I swore I would never be powerless again, never be the victim. I started small, protection, exactly what had killed my father. The irony wasn't lost on me. I became the thing I hated. Simone paused, wiping her eyes. Grace handed her a tissue. But I told myself I was different. I told myself I had rules, that I wouldn't hurt innocent people, that I was protecting my community. Every criminal tells themselves these lies. We build elaborate justifications for our choices, castles made of sand that wash away the moment we're forced to look at them clearly. Then I met you. You were everything I wasn't, honest, compassionate, working to build people up instead of tearing them down. When you looked at me, I saw who I could have been, who I should have been. I thought about walking away then, but I was already too deep. There were people depending on me, debts that couldn't be forgiven, enemies who would see any weakness as an opportunity. I told myself I would protect you by keeping you separate, by building a wall between my two lives. Another lie. The truth is, I was a coward. I was afraid that if you knew who I really was, you'd leave. So I hid. I lied. I let you love a version of me that didn't exist. Simone's voice broke. She handed the letter to Grace, unable to continue. Grace picked up where she left off. When I learned I was dying, my first thought was relief. Relief that I wouldn't have to face the consequences of my choices. That I could slip away and leave you with your illusions intact. Another act of cowardice. But then you found the files, and I saw your face when you realized what I was. The devastation. The betrayal. In that moment, I finally understood what I'd done to you. You asked me that night who I was. I've thought about that question every day since. The answer is, I was a man who let fear turn him into a monster. I was a man who chose power over integrity, safety over honesty, control over love. But in our last weeks together, watching you struggle with whether to give me one more chance, I tried to be something different. I tried to be brave. I tried to be honest. I tried to be worthy of the mercy you showed me. I failed at that too, in the end. There's no making up for what I did. No redemption arc that erases the harm I caused. People died because of my choices. Families were destroyed. Communities were poisoned by the poison I spread. But I stopped it. With your strength and Grace's courage, and yes, I see the irony in her name, I finally did the right thing. Not for redemption, not even for forgiveness, but because it was right. The money I've left you is clean. I made sure of that. It's not enough, nothing could be, but it's enough for you to choose your own path forward. Start a new nonprofit. Travel the world. Buy a small house by the ocean. Whatever brings you peace. I don't ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I hope someday you can find peace with what happened. I hope you can remember the good moments without the shadow of my lies darkening them completely. I hope you can love again, someone worthy of you this time. Tell Grace thank you. She saved both of us in different ways. She reminded me that silence in the face of wrong is its own kind of crime. She taught me that it's never too late to speak the truth, even when the cost is high. I loved you, Simone. That was the one true thing in my life of lies. I'm sorry it wasn't enough. I'm sorry I wasn't enough. Be happy. That's all I want for you now. Be happy, be free, be the light you always were. Yours, even though I have no right to be asterisk. Tae-jin. The apartment was silent, except for the sound of Simone's quiet crying. Grace set the letter down and moved to sit beside her, pulling her into an embrace. "He really did love you," Grace said softly. "I know." Simone's voice was muffled against Grace's shoulder. "That's what makes it so hard. If he'd been a monster, just evil through and through, it would be easier. But he was a person. Flawed and broken and wrong, but a person. And I loved him too." 2 weeks later, a woman appeared at Simone's door. She was Asian, perhaps in her mid-30s, with exhausted eyes and a small boy clinging to her hand. "Mrs. Kim," the woman asked in accented English, "my name is Min-jae Park. I was married to one of your husband's associates, Park Yi-sung." Simone recognized the name. Park had been one of Tae-jin's lieutenants, now serving 15 years in federal prison. "I'm sorry," Simone said carefully. "I don't know what I can do for you." "I'm not asking for anything," Min-jae said quickly. I needed to see you, to say thank you." Simone blinked. "Thank you." Min-jae looked down at her son, who was maybe 5 years old. "My husband was a bad man. I knew it, but I was trapped. No money of my own, no family here, and Yi-sung said if I ever tried to leave, he would." She swallowed hard. "When your husband testified, when everything fell apart, I finally got free. I have a job now, a real one, an apartment. My son is safe." The little boy looked up at Simone with curious eyes. "Your husband's testimony didn't just take down criminals," Min-jae continued. "It freed their victims too. The women who were trafficked, the business owners who were being extorted, the families who lived in fear. I know he did terrible things, but in the end, he saved us." Simone felt tears welling up again. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know, whatever else he was, he gave us a chance at a real life." Min-jae bowed slightly, then took her son's hand. "Thank you for standing by him long enough for him to do the right thing. I know it must have cost you everything." As Simone watched them walk away, she felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding that the story was bigger than just her pain, that Tae-jin's final choice had rippled out in ways she couldn't have imagined. That evening, Grace came by with dinner, homemade Nigerian stew, rich and comforting. They ate in companionable silence for a while before Grace spoke. "I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago." Simone looked up, concerned. "What is it?" Grace set down her spoon. "Remember when I told you about my husband? How he was a bad man and I left him when he got sick?" "Yes." "I lied, part of it anyway." Grace's hands were shaking. "He was a bad man, that part was true, but I didn't just leave him. I turned him into the police." Simone waited, sensing there was more. "He was stealing from his employer, a construction company. Not just stealing, he was part of a scheme that cut corners on safety regulations. People got hurt. A young man fell from scaffolding because they'd skipped inspections to save money. He was paralyzed." Grace's voice grew thick with emotion. "I found the documents in our house. I knew if I spoke up, my husband would go to jail. We'd lose everything. But I kept thinking about that young man, about his family, about all the other workers at risk because of what my husband was doing." "So you went to the police," Simone said quietly. "Yes, and my husband did go to jail. And I did lose everything, my home, my standing in the community, most of my friends. People called me a traitor, said a wife should stand by her husband no matter what." Grace looked directly at Simone. "But I never regretted it, not once." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because when I heard Mr. Kim begging you for one more round, when I stood in that doorway and spoke up, I wasn't just thinking about you. I was thinking about all the people who would be affected by your choice. And I was thinking about who I was when I stayed silent, and who I became when I finally found my voice." Grace reached across the table and took Simone's hand. "You gave Mr. Kim his one more round. You stood by him long enough for him to do the right thing, even though it cost you your marriage, your trust, your peace. But because you did, people like Min-jae got free. That young man whose life was destroyed by my husband's company, he got justice because I spoke up, even though it destroyed my life as I knew it." "But it hurt," Simone whispered. "It still hurts." "Of course it does. Doing the right thing doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. It doesn't mean we don't have scars, but those scars, they're proof that we were brave when it mattered, that we chose truth over comfort, justice over peace. 6 months after Tae-jin's death, Simone stood in front of a small office space in Koreatown. The sign above the door read, Second Chances Foundation, supporting families affected by crime and incarceration. Grace stood beside her, along with Marcus Chen, who had agreed to serve on the board. Min-jae was there too, with her son. And there were others, a dozen people whose lives had been touched by Tae-jin's organization, for better or worse, who had come to witness this new beginning. I thought about calling it the Tae-jin Kim Memorial Foundation, Simone said to the gathered crowd. But that felt wrong. This isn't about memorializing him or redeeming his legacy. This is about taking the resources he left behind and using them to help the people his choices hurt. She unlocked the door. Inside, the office was still mostly empty, but the walls were painted a warm yellow, and there were desks waiting for volunteers, and filing cabinets ready to be filled with case files of people who needed help. We're going to help families of incarcerated people, support for children, job training for spouses, counseling for everyone affected. We're going to work with people trying to leave gangs and criminal organizations. We're going to provide legal aid for victims of crime who can't afford lawyers. Simone's voice grew stronger. We're going to break the cycles that trapped my husband and so many others. And we're going to tell the truth, Grace added. About crime and consequences, about how systems trap people, about how hard it is to get out and how much courage it takes to try. Min-jae stepped forward. I'll be your first success story, she said. And your first volunteer. I want to help other women like me find their way out. 1 year after Tae-jin's death, Simone visited his grave alone. It was a simple headstone in a quiet cemetery with only his name and dates. No epitaphs about loving husband or devoted friend, just the facts. She set down a single white rose, the flower he'd given her on their first date. I read your letter again last week, she said to the stone. All 10 pages. I've read it probably 100 times now, looking for, I don't know what, absolution maybe, or maybe just trying to understand. A breeze rustled through the trees. The foundation is doing well. We've helped 43 families so far. Min-jae is incredible. She's studying for her GED, and she translates for Korean families who need our services. Grace is teaching a class on speaking up when you witness wrongdoing. It's popular. Turns out a lot of people need to hear that it's okay to break silence, even when it's scary. Simone sat down on the grass beside the headstone. I'm not sure I forgive you yet. Some days I think I'm getting there, and then something will remind me of how thoroughly you lied to me. And the anger comes flooding back. Gee. Race says that's normal. She says healing isn't linear. She traced the letters of his name carved in the stone. But I understand you better now. I understand how someone can start with pain and fear and let it twist them into something they never meant to be. I understand how easy it is to tell yourself that your reasons justify your actions. I see it in the people we help, people who made terrible choices for what seemed like good reasons at the time. A tear rolled down her cheek. You asked me in that letter if I could remember the good moments without the shadow of your lies darkening them. I'm trying. I can remember the night you proposed, how nervous you were. I can remember Sunday mornings making breakfast together. I can remember the way you held me when my mother died. She pulled a photograph from her pocket, the two of them on their wedding day, laughing at something out of frame. They looked so young, so hopeful. I loved you, that was real, and you loved me. That was real too, everything else. She sighed. Everything else was complicated and messy and painful, but those two things were true. Simone stood, brushing grass from her jeans. I'm going to be okay. Better than okay, actually. The foundation is giving me purpose. Grace and I are talking about expanding to other cities. Min-jae's son calls me Auntie Simone now, and it makes my heart full in a way I didn't expect. She touched the top of the headstone one last time. You got your one more round. You used it to tear down what you'd built and try to make something right from the wreckage. It wasn't redemption. I don't think redemption was possible for everything you did, but it was something. It was courage, finally, at the end. As she walked back to her car, Simone felt lighter than she had in months. Not healed, not whole, but healing, moving forward. That evening, Grace and Simone sat on Simone's small balcony, watching the Lowe's angels sunset paint the sky in oranges and purples. "Do you think he died in peace?" Simone asked. Grace considered the question carefully, as she always did. "I think he died knowing he'd finally done the right thing. Whether that brought him peace, only he could say. But I saw his face in those last days. He looked relieved, like he'd been carrying something heavy his whole life and finally set it down." "Min-jae's husband, Park, he sent me a letter from prison," Simone said. "Angry, blaming Tae-jin for ruining his life, blaming me for supporting the testimony. He said we destroyed everything he'd built." "What did you do?" "I wrote him back, told him about Min-jae and his son, how they're thriving now, how his son is in a good school and learning English and Korean, how Min-jae smiles now, really smiles, in a way she apparently never did when she was with him." "How did he respond?" "He hasn't, maybe he won't. Maybe he'll spend his whole sentence blaming everyone but himself." Simone took a sip of her tea. "But that's his choice. Just like it was Tae-jin's choice to finally take responsibility and my choice to give him the chance to do it." Grace nodded. "You know what I've learned in my 64 years? People want to believe in redemption arcs, in clean endings where the bad person becomes good and everyone forgives and moves on. But real life is messier than that." "Much messier," Simone agreed. "Sometimes the bad person does one good thing at the end, and it doesn't erase all the bad, but it still matters. Sometimes the hurt spouse gives one more chance not because she's forgiven, but because it's the right thing to do for reasons bigger than her own pain. Sometimes the maid who's been silent for months finally speaks up and changes everything." "Sometimes there are no clean endings," Simone said. "No, but there can be honest ones. Endings where we tell the truth about the complexity, where we acknowledge both the harm and the courage, where we hold space for anger and understanding to exist in the same heart." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon. "Grace." "Yes, dear." "Thank you for speaking up that night, for telling me your story, for staying with me through all of this." Grace reached over and squeezed her hand. "Thank you for listening, and for being brave enough to make the hard choice. You could have walked away, let him die with his secrets intact, protected yourself from all of this mess. But you didn't." "I couldn't. Once I knew the truth, I couldn't just pretend I didn't." "That's integrity," Grace said firmly. "That's the same quality that made me turn in my husband, even though it cost me everything. The inability to live with ourselves if we stay silent in the face of wrong." "Does it ever get easier, the weight of it?" "It does, not because the past changes, but because we get stronger. We build new things, help new people, create new stories that aren't about what was done to us or what we lost, but about who we chose to become in the aftermath." Epilogue, 5 years later. The Second Chances Foundation now operated in 6 cities across California. Grace, at 68, had finally retired from active work, but still came to board meetings and special events. Min-jae had earned her master's degree in social work and was the foundation's director of family services. Her son was 10 now, thriving in school, with no memory of the fear that had defined his early years. Simone stood at a podium in Sacramento, testifying before the state legislature about criminal justice reform. She'd become a respected voice in the field, sought out for her unique perspective as someone who had lived on both sides of the story. "My late husband was a criminal," she said into the microphone, her voice steady and clear. "He hurt people. He built an organization that caused immeasurable harm to communities, families, individuals. There is no justifying that, and I'm not here to try." The legislators listened intently. But in his final weeks, he made a choice. He could have stayed silent, protected his legacy, let his organization pass to someone else who would continue the harm. Instead, he spoke. He testified. He tore down what he'd built. Simone paused, making eye contact with people around the room. His testimony led to the freedom of dozens of people who were trapped in criminal enterprises. It shut down trafficking operations. It gave law enforcement the tools to dismantle one of the most dangerous organizations in California. And yes, it also meant his associates went to prison, and their families suffered in different ways. She took a breath. This is the complexity we need to grapple with in criminal justice reform. People are rarely all good or all bad. Systems trap people in cycles of crime and violence, but people also make choices. Accountability matters, but so does the possibility of change. Punishment is necessary. But so is the support that helps people and families rebuild after incarceration. The foundation I run was built from the wreckage of my husband's criminal empire. We use those resources to help the very people his organization hurt. We support families of the incarcerated, including the families of the men who worked for him. We help people exit gangs and criminal organizations. We provide trauma counseling and legal aid and job training. Simone's voice grew passionate. We tell the truth, all of it, the harm and the healing, the wrong and the attempt to make it right, the cost of crime and the cost of redemption, because that's the only way forward. Not clean stories about villains and heroes, but honest stories about broken people trying to do better. When she finished, the chamber erupted in applause. Later, outside the Capitol building, Grace was waiting with Min-jae and her son. You were magnificent, Grace said, hugging her tight. I just told the truth, Simone replied. That's what makes it magnificent, Min-jae added. So many people want to simplify stories, make them fit neat categories. You refuse to do that. Min-jae's son, now called David by his American friends, tugged on Simone's sleeve. Auntie Simone, my teacher says I have to write about a hero for homework. Can I write about you? Simone knelt down to his level. You know what? Write about your mom. She's the real hero. She got out of a dangerous situation, built a new life, went to school, and now helps other people do the same thing. That's real courage. Can I write about you too? David asked. And Miss Grace, you're all heroes. Min-jae smiled. How about you write about all the women who refuse to stay silent, about how speaking up can change everything? Okay, David ran ahead, already composing his essay in his head. The three women walked together down the Capitol steps, 3 lives that had intersected at the worst possible moment and somehow come out the other side transformed. Do you ever wonder, Simone asked, what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up that night, Grace? If you just stayed silent like you had for 8 months? Every day, Grace admitted. And every day I'm grateful I found the courage when it mattered. But I also know it wasn't just me. You had the courage to give him one more chance. Min-jae had the courage to accept the freedom that chance created and build something new. Tae-jin had the courage, finally, to tell the truth. And what about all the people he hurt before that? Simone asked. How do we hold both things, the harm he caused and the good his testimony did? We hold them the same way we hold anything complicated and true, Grace said. With honesty, with humility, with acknowledgement that life is rarely simple and people are rarely only one thing. They reached Simone's car, where she'd parked in the visitor lot. 5 years, Simone said, looking back at the Capitol building. 5 years since he died. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Grief is like that, Grace said. Even complicated grief for complicated people. Do you think I've forgiven him? Grace looked at her carefully. Do you? Simone thought about it, really thought about it. I think I've forgiven him for not being who I thought he was, for being human and flawed and broken. I don't know if I've forgiven him for lying to me, for building his life on harm, for all the specific choices he made. Maybe that's enough, Min-jae suggested. Maybe forgiveness doesn't have to be all or nothing. Maybe it can be partial, complicated, ongoing. Like everything else in this story, Simone said with a slight smile. As they drove back toward Los Angeles, past the Golden Hills and endless California sky, Simone thought about Tae-jin's letter, still kept in her bedside drawer. I don't ask for your forgiveness, he'd written, but I hope someday you can find peace. Peace, not forgiveness, not forgetting, not even complete understanding, just peace. Looking at the road ahead, at the foundation they'd built, at the lives they'd changed, at the truth they'd chosen to tell even when it was painful, Simone thought maybe she was finally getting there. The Mafia boss had begged for one more round, not knowing the Black Maid was listening. And that moment, that intersection of his desperation, Grace's courage, and Simone's impossible choice, had changed everything. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but truly. And in the end, truth was enough.